right, good evening, everyone. All right, thank you so much for taking time out of your week to come and participate in People's Planning Academy 2.0. I see a lot of familiar faces. My name is Brittany Redd. I'm the Principal Planner for Land Use Strategy for the City of Indianapolis's Department of Metropolitan Development. Real quick, by a show of hands, how many people participated in the first People's Planning Academy? Yes, I knew I saw some familiar faces. Well, thank you so much for coming back and participating in the second round of People's Planning Academy. Our first People's Planning Academy, which took place in 2017, focused on the Marion County Land Use Plan. The graduates of that People's Planning Academy played a crucial role in informing policy recommendations. They informed the Marion County Land Use Plan, and they also help prove the value of investing in our residents and educating them in a way that can empower them to make real change in our city. A special thank you to our host, the Indianapolis Neighborhood Resource Center, for partnering with the City of Indianapolis to make the People's Planning Academy 2.0 possible. If you're not familiar with the INRC's work, they provide training, resources, and support to neighborhood associations and neighborhood-based organizations throughout Marion County. They also cultivate emerging leaders through AmeriCorps Public Allies. I see a couple AmeriCorps Public Allies in the audience. Shout out to Class 6, the best class. All right, and now let's go over the agenda for the evening. First, we'll discuss what to expect over the next 6 weeks. Next, I'll hand it over to Brad Bobian, the administrator for the Division of Long Range Planning, who will talk about Planning 101. This will include what is planning, who plans the city, and he'll also provide you with the basics of transportation planning. I'll come back and give you some more information about the Marion County Land Use Pattern Book and what role that plays in transportation planning. We'll have a brief 10-minute break, and then Daniel Hedgelin, Senior Planner for Information and Innovation, will talk to you about zoning. How does that sound? Good? All right. Before we continue, I want to acknowledge that we gather here on the traditional land of the Miami people to honor with gratitude the land itself and people who have been stewards of the land for generations. This is a call to action, a commitment to continually learn how to be better stewards of the land we inhabit. So let's get to what the purpose of the Academy is. I want to start by sharing a quote with you. An educated, enlightened, and informed population is one of the surest ways of promoting the health of a democracy. This is a quote by Nelson Mandela. And I believe this is the heart of People's Planning Academy. This is a collaborative space of learning. This is an opportunity for you to transform the city and be leaders in the city. Our goals for the Academy are to invest in leaders. We believe that each one of you can become a planning leader and stronger advocates for your community. We want to ensure that people who engage in planning processes in our community are representative of the population. And lastly, we want to increase resident capacity to lead planning processes for the certified plans, which we'll talk a little bit in our later classes. And I hope the Academy inspires ideas and discussions around the ways that we can make our city a better place. So just a few logistics. The class will wrap up tonight at 6:30. This is a 6 weeks class. So those of you here today probably signed up for the weekday class. We're very flexible, so if something comes up and you need to miss one of those weekday classes, we also provide the class on a Saturday session. So feel free to mix and match those. You'll hear a lot of information tonight, as well as the other classes to come, and we'll provide you with the slides and like different materials that we provide over the course of the classes. So don't feel like you have to write everything down. We'll provide you with that information. Here's an overview of the class schedule. All classes are required to graduate, but keep in mind there's the Saturday class that you can attend if you miss a class. Classes will also be available on Channel 16 and then also on YouTube. We'll let you know when you can have the links to those and where those will be located. So this class tonight will focus on planning and zoning 101. And just a couple of ground rules to allow our conversation to flow more freely. I'd like to go over some of these. So first one, everyone is welcome. Everyone here cares about building a better city, so be civil and respectful. Nobody is right and nobody is wrong. We all have unique experiences and perspectives. Listen, share, and ask to understand. Focus on interest, not positions. So if everyone feels okay with those ground rules, we can go ahead and begin. You guys feel good about those? All right. All right, so I'll go ahead and hand it over to Brad to talk about Planning 101.
All right, thank you, Brittany. And as she said, I lead the long-range planning team. Can everyone hear me? All right. So we've got an amazing team. Most of them are here tonight. We did not introduce Andrea Miller, who was out front, but she's an important part of our team too. And so for those of you who were here in the first academy, there's a brief repeat of something about budget. And so I'm sorry if I give you PTSD over the budget slides, but hold tight. We do have some new content when we talk about the thoroughfare plan. And so conceptually, what is city planning? And so when you hear the word planning, that can mean lots of different things to many different people. And because of that, people often misunderstand what a city plan actually is, what it actually means. And so one type of planning is like saying, I'm planning to take a trip to Disney World this fall on fall break. What does that mean? That means I likely have my flights booked, I likely have my tickets to the park booked, I probably have a hotel, and I probably asked my boss for the time off. I'm planning to go to Disney World this fall, right? Now, another type of planning isn't really as concrete as that. It's more of a goal, like saying, I want to climb Mount Everest sometime in my life. I don't have my tickets booked to Nepal. I don't have climbing equipment. I don't have visas and all of that sorted out. And honestly, I'm out of breath at the top of an escalator. And so I'm probably not prepared to climb Mount Everest, right? Now, by show of hands, what is city planning more like? Is city planning more like the trip to Disney World? Or is city planning more like climbing Mount Everest? And so it's more like, there's aspects of both, but city planning is more like Mount Everest because it's aspirational. It describes what we would like to see happen in the future. It's a guide. It's not something that is guaranteed to happen because things change, because our city is made up of 1 million people. Things change. So if you can remember that city planning is much more like Mount Everest than booking your flight for Disney World, you're well on your way to understanding the role of city planning. Now, one analogy for city planning is your family budget. We all have budgets, whether they're written down or they're Excel or they're just in our heads, right? The purpose of a budget is really to help you achieve your goals. And so you want a house or an apartment to live in, and so you set aside money to pay rent or to pay your mortgage. You know that you need to get to work, and so you set aside money for gas or for a bus pass. And you know that you have that goal of going to Disney World in a few months, and so you set aside some cash each month for that to reach that goal. Now, planning does the same thing for our city. It helps us allocate land and resources to help our community achieve our community goals. We know that we need jobs for residents, and so we need land and roads for industry. We know we need a variety of places for those residents to live, and so we build neighborhoods with houses and townhomes and apartments. And we know we need places for our neighbors to socialize and protect wildlife and our ecology, and so we build parks and have natural places. So like your budget, that balances competing needs. You can't do everything with your money. City plans help us balance our community desires. Now, getting back to our family budget, how many of you have had an unplanned expense come up this year? Right? It happens. It's not in our budget. Water heaters leak, our car breaks down, the Colts reach the playoffs, maybe not. Or it's super cold, the polar vortex comes back and we have a crazy high heating bill. Most of our budget is based on knowns. We know what our rent or our mortgage is probably going to be. We can estimate how much we need for utilities and food. But there's always those unexpected things that come along, and when those occur, we have to deviate from our budget. You might skip a month or two of savings or postpone that Disney World trip a little bit so that your family has a hot water heater today. Planning for a city is certainly more complicated, but the concept is very similar. We can estimate how many housing units we need in the future based on population trends. We have rules of thumb as planners for how much park space we need. We know where there's floodplains that are going to flood based on topography of the land. So we have some knowns. We know the industry needs highway interchanges and major commercial areas need good roads and transit service. But we can't anticipate everything. Major population shifts nationally and globally to the southwest happened, and that can have tremendous impacts on Rust Belt communities. Development upstream in Hamilton County changes where floods happen here, because where does the water go? It comes down. Planning for a city, like I said, is certainly more complicated, but it's very much like your budgets. Now, another concept to understand is that your budget is just a file, it's just a piece of paper, it's just a piece of your mind, right? It's a tool to help you make decisions about how to spend your money in the future. Just because you set aside $500 each month for groceries or for eating out doesn't mean that you actually spend $500 doing those things. You spend it one grocery store trip at a time. In my case, one Taco Bell trip at a time. The budget helps you evaluate whether that $40 steak downtown is a good idea or not, but individual decisions to write that check or swipe that card is what spends the money. Now, planning is very similar. Remember how plans are like Mount Everest? They're aspirational or goals. City plans themselves don't actually build or change anything on the ground. Just because we aspire to have commercial development on this corner doesn't necessarily mean it will happen. Why? Because city government doesn't actually build much of the city. Whether that corner is suitable for commercial development or not really depends on whether someone sees an opportunity to make money building it, whether or not they can convince a bank to lend money, and ultimately whether customers will actually be there to support it. So plans don't go into the detailed financial, environmental, market analysis for all 350,000 parcels in Marion County or all 8,000 miles of roadway that we have in our city. That's because they're aspirational, decision-making documents, not a guarantee necessarily of what can be built. And then my final budget analogy, and then we'll be over the budgets, I promise, for the rest of the time, is that as much as I wish they could, budgets can't undo past decisions. So maybe I couldn't really have afforded that $40 steak downtown, but it tasted so good. That money's gone. I can't get that back, right? There's nothing I can do. Similarly, plans are future-oriented. They don't change what's on the ground actually right now. They're decision-making frameworks for the future. So plans come into play when it's time to make decisions about how things change. But just because we want a farm to become a new neighborhood doesn't mean that Sally Farmer has to stop farming. It's a future decision. So conceptually, city planning is aspirational. It's about our future, right? So the next step is who actually plans our city? Now, I work for the city's Department of Metropolitan Development. We are one department in city government charged with long-range planning in our community. There are lots of other partners, both within city government as well as outside, that do planning, but we're the official planning entity for the city. And in planning, we have two sides. There's my side, that's long-range planning. We look at the future. That future could be next weekend, That future could be next generation. We also have partners in our team that look at current planning. Current planning is what we refer to the team that looks at zoning cases. And so when you see an orange sign pop up in your neighborhood, our current planning. Current planning deals with projects that are in the pipeline right now. So we obviously work together, we're partners, but one is future-oriented, one is today-oriented. We'll talk more about zoning here at the end of the class. There are other parts of our department that also do planning-like activities. And so we have a division called Community and Economic Development. And they work on things like distributing federal community development dollars to do projects in neighborhoods. We work on incentive projects that actually build other projects and do tax abatements and things like that that attract jobs and investment to our community. And we also have redevelopment that look at some brownfields and abandoned industrial properties, abandoned homes and things like that, and try to get them back into purpose. And so all of those people and those teams do planning-like functions, even though they're not technically called city planners. Now you'll notice off to the side, we're working on rebuilding a transportation planning team within city government. It's something we have not had in several decades. And so that will be a joint team that sits between Public Works, who are our partners in implementing projects, and long-range planning. So that's in process. But like I said, there's lots of other partners that do planning in the city. It's not just city planners. And so we have in our team the Indianapolis Historic Preservation Commission. Any of you live in a historic district? A few? So the historic preservation people do planning and zoning for the historic preservation districts, and so they're kind of us for those neighborhoods. I mentioned the Department of Public Works. They're often one of our biggest implementers when they come down to selecting projects and actually getting them built. And so while we do the long-range transportation planning, they're the ones that actually select and fund and build those projects. Indy Parks, similarly, does planning, both long-term and kind of master planning for all of our park properties in the Indy Parks system. Similarly, the Office of Sustainability is our partner working on sustainability and resiliency planning for our community. Indigo will be here at our next class talking about the Marion County Transit Plan, but Indigo obviously is the planning entity and the operator for our public transportation system in our city. The Marion County Health Department works on health planning for our community, but they also get involved in some zoning cases, especially related to well fields where we get our drinking water from. The Metropolitan Planning Organization, anyone heard of the MPO? The MPO is a regional planning entity that right now is focused primarily on distributing the federal transportation funding we get, but they are gradually adding on more tasks to think about regional efforts, both Marion County and all the counties around us. And then there's non-governmental entities completely. So nonprofit organizations, Local Initiative Support Corporation, for example, is an entity that has worked on great places and quality of life planning, if you've heard those words. That's a privately driven process through nonprofit partners. And then the Indy Chamber and something called CICP, the Central Indiana Corporate Partnership. That is really where the region's economic development planning lives. And so there's lots of partners that do city planning that don't have the title of city planning, that don't report to me. My world is something called the comprehensive plan. Anyone ever heard of the comprehensive plan, the comp plan? Yeah, so the comp plan is something that's legally required in Indiana, and it's something that in planning school is kind of the thing that we do as city planners. But in layman's terms, the comprehensive plan is a tool to address the change that happens in our community. That change can be evolution, it can be growth, and sometimes it can be even decline in our community. And the comprehensive plan is that decision-making framework that lays out how we want to see our community change. Now, here in Indianapolis, the comprehensive plan is really a framework organized around 7 different elements, or gears in this diagram. Think of each of those gears as a chapter of the comprehensive plan. Some chapters even have some subheadings, and we'll talk about one of those subheadings here in a second, called the Thoroughfare Plan. Now, in many jurisdictions, the comprehensive plan is actually a single plan developed at a single point in time. In Indy, our comprehensive plan is made up of a dozen or more different documents, some of them up here. Now, if you've been involved in some of our planning processes before, the word comp plan is oftentimes associated with the orange gear on this diagram, the land use plan. But remember, and Brittany will come back and talk a little bit about the land use plan here in a second. The land use plan is one piece of the comprehensive plan. We also have a thing called Indy Moves, which is our transportation plan. We'll come back to that next session. We also have the Indy Parks Master Plan or comprehensive plan. And we also have the Thrive Indianapolis Resiliency Plan. So there's all those pieces that work together to form our comprehensive plan. Now in this class, so last time we really focused on the land use plan. We'll give a refresher on that here in a second, as well as tie it into transportation. But we'll also begin focusing on some aspects of our transportation planning world. Next time, I'll talk about Indy Moves, which is our umbrella transportation plan, as well as we'll have Indigo talk about the Marion County Transit Plan. And so that's the plan for the bus rapid transit system, as well as our local bus expansion. But here I'm going to talk today into a little more detail about how planners think about roads and how we talk about roads. And we do that through a thing called the thoroughfare plan. Anyone heard of a thoroughfare plan? A couple of you? All right. Well, by the end of this, you'll be tired of thoroughfare plans. All right, so let's have a little bit of fun. And so on your tables, there's a big white piece of paper. Flip that over. And so we have 6 different neighborhoods. These are not in Indianapolis, and so don't try to locate them. We intentionally did not pick Indy neighborhoods. But there are 6 types of neighborhoods that you have in front of you. And so as a table, we're going to spend the next 10 minutes or so having a table conversation, and then we'll come back and kind of have a group conversation about it. And so there are 4 things I want you to look at. Again, you don't know where this place is. You know nothing about what you see. There's no labels on here. There's no street names. There's no nothing, right? And so we want you to read what you see. So the first question is, what do you think people do here? What do you think people do in that district? Once you figure that out, think about how people get around. And that's based on what people do, but also what you see on the map. And then next, talk about how comfortable you would be getting around in that neighborhood a variety of different ways. So walking and biking and driving and taking a bus, but also driving a semi-truck, things like that. And then finally, zero in on the road network. Can you tell which roads are busier and why? And so we'll take about 10 minutes and then we'll do a report out. All right, so let's have a conversation about what some of you found. And so everyone can see what you had. What tables had number 1? All right, so just kind of shout out, what do you think people do here? They drive. What are they driving to?
Work, shopping.
What are they driving to? What types of places?
Work.
So work, people probably work here. Shopping. What makes you say work and shopping? So there's a lot of parking. There's big roads. Is that all people do here? There's no right or wrong answer. Right, so interstate you associate with jobs, right? Because a lot of people come there. Sasha mentioned that there are some neighborhoods, a little neighborhood there to the bottom left. All right, so how do you think people get around here? Drive a car. Are there sidewalks here?
Yeah, you can't really walk from this neighborhood at the bottom because it's like 8 lanes across the highway.
Right, and so there are sidewalks here. This community actually has sidewalks everywhere. It's a little different than us, but there are sidewalks, but you still say people don't walk. Why? Right, so where are you going to go? The scale, it's scary to walk across 7, 8 lanes of traffic. It's scary to walk under or over an interstate, right? All right. Now, if you were
So we've answered, if you were walking, you probably wouldn't feel comfortable here. How about if you were biking?
Probably in the neighborhood, nowhere else.
In the neighborhood? Why wouldn't you want to bike on that 8-lane street? Anyone know? Right, super high speed. Right. Now, what if you were a semi-truck making deliveries to that Meijer or that Walmart? Does this feel comfortable for you? Right. Now, that's important too. We have to get trucks into our places too, right? All right. Now, neighborhood 2 actually doesn't exist. So those of you who have a number 2 on your map, you actually have number 5. And so we're going to skip that. That's my fault. So who had number 3? All right. What do people do here? Looks like a college, a school, campus. So maybe a corporate campus. A lot of residents. Okay. What types of residents? So you've got single family, and that's this stuff, right? So multifamily, right? And so you've got, these probably are not big enough for commercial buildings, so they might be row houses or townhomes, something like that. Then you've also got, this white square here with a pool in the middle. It might be an apartment building.
Military base.
So military base. Any other activities that people do here?
There's commercials, retail.
Yeah, so there on the left, you actually see some big box retail. It's actually a grocery store. I know this place. So there's a mix of different uses. How do you think people get around based on those uses? Multimodal. So you would feel comfortable walking here? Why? Okay, so there's lots of places to cross.
Short blocks, streetscape, tree home.
Right, so you see trees, you see sidewalks, things like that. It's a little more comfortable. Right, and so there's a 4-lane street in here, but does it look like a 4-lane street? No, it's got that median esplanade thing in the middle, right? It's actually got a jogging path down. Boulevard, right. Right, so if you're driving a semi-truck through here, would you feel comfortable?
Well, there are routes that semi-truck can use, so you wouldn't want to go down that alley.
Right, and so there are places on here that trucks feel comfortable, and there are places where they don't, and that's based on the lane use, right? All right. I will tell, these are all in one city, I'll tell you at the end. If you know me, you should know where the city is at. So neighborhood number 4, who had number 4? All right, what do you do here? You sleep. Do you do anything else? Play golf? I don't know what that is. Right, so pretty much all you do here is live, right? Is there anything but houses, single-family houses here? No, so you don't see schools or churches or places of worship, things like that? Right, so how do you think people get around here? Why do you all say car? So you see lots of driveways, so lots of curb cuts cutting across the sidewalk, right? You think people walk and bike here? Where do you think they go? For leisure, right. And so when we get to the next neighborhood, we'll talk about walking for different purposes. But here, if you're walking, it's really for recreation, right? It's for fun. And that's fine. There's nothing wrong with that. Now, if you were taking public transit, so you run the bus, does this neighborhood work? No. You have to walk a long way. And so imagine if you're on one of these cul-de-sacs down here and the bus stop is up here. You can't walk through people's backyards, they're probably fenced, and so you have to follow the roads. And that's a long walk, simply because of how the roads are laid out, right? All right, so neighborhood number 2 and 5. So there are lots of you. Who had 2 and 5? All right, so what do people do here?
Work and play.
so they live, work, and play. Anyone else have a different answer? All right, so you see houses. What do you see in the middle? Right, so those are bigger buildings, right? They've got different colored roofs and they're bigger footprints, and so those are probably
That's like garage.
that's actually Main Street looking retail, and so
Well, I mean, the retail have garage?
no.
No.
So that's a good observation. There's not a lot of parking lots here, are there? So who do you think comes to this retail node? Right. How do you think they get there primarily? They walk. And so we have smaller scale retail buildings, very different from the large scale retail buildings that we saw on that first slide, right? And so this is a neighborhood oriented commercial area. And so the parking needs are dramatically different because of the modes of transportation. All right, and then neighborhood number 6. Who was the lucky ones that had 6? All right, what do people do here?
Work.
They work, right? These are warehouses. Is it easy to drive a semi around in here?
Yes.
Why?
It's designed for that.
It's designed for that. It's got big roads. It's easy to make turns. Now, there's actually sidewalks here, right? There's sidewalks and there's trees. That's why I said this is clearly not Indianapolis. Yes, and so these are places to work. Now, I'm going to go through this in reverse, and let's talk about what's the major road. And so those of you that had this industrial area, how can you tell which ones are the major roads?
Over on the right and across the top, they have meridians in between them, splitting their multiple lanes.
Yep. So they've got medians splitting the lanes. Those, they provide turn lanes at the intersections. Okay. For those of you that had, that had 2 and 5, what's the major street here? So the one that goes through the business district? The intersection. So the south kind of corner. This would be like the major intersection. And what makes you say that? It's a little wider. You said it's got a yellow line, right? So it's got a yellow line. Good observation.
The houses, no houses.
No houses. So the land use is different around it, right? And so fewer trees. All right, how about those of you that had, I can't go the right way.
I killed the mic.
So those of you that had the more kind of suburban rural area, what's the major street? The east-west, and why do you say that? It's wider. It's straight and not curvy, right? And so we'll actually come back to that observation here in a little bit. All right, so this neighborhood, what's the major street? Up at the top? And why do you say that? It's very large, right? Very wide. Is that 2 streets or is that 1 street that's divided? Right, so it does split up, but that is a very large street. But it does have a median, a pretty large median down the middle. Now there's also a pretty large street down the middle that goes east-west, right? How's that different? Designed for foot traffic, and what makes you say that?
Well, it's got a large space in the middle with trees and some kind of jogging path.
And then finally, what's the major street here? This one's pretty obvious. Right, so you have an interstate and it has on and off ramps. Nothing stops here, right? All right, so that's, thank you for playing along with us here. And so the key thing I hope you got from that
Land use and transportation are intimately related, right? We need different types of roadways to serve different types of development patterns. And so just as you all recognize that some streets have yellow paint on them, some have more lanes, some have medians, some have turn lanes and crosswalks and things like that, we planners think about streets like that too. Now I'm going to give you a little insight into our technical jargon about that here in the thoroughfare plan. This is one of our more technical transportation plans. I'm going to talk about the big picture next time when we talk about Indy moves. The thoroughfare plan, anyone know what a thoroughfare is? Yeah, a thoroughfare plan is our plan for streets. Basically, we call them thoroughfares. There are two primary functions. Every community has a thoroughfare plan, and I'll talk a little bit about why we have that. It's actually a federal system. But every community has slightly different aspects of the thoroughfare plan, and ours really has two functions. One is for design guidelines, and so we talk about the types of transportation facilities, like sidewalks and bike lanes and parking lanes and travel lanes. We talk about where those are appropriate and where those aren't. So those are design guidelines. And then we also use the plan to classify roadways, and that is its technical federal purpose. And we'll come back to that here in a second. Now, our goal is to have a city that has streets that are friendly for everyone. A lot of that is dependent on the surrounding land use, and so we all recognize that we have to get trucks in to serve the businesses that we want to frequent. And so we have places like Broad Ripple and Fountain Square that have deliveries that come in on semi-trucks. Those are also very pedestrian-oriented places, and so there are places where sometimes our land uses needs and kind of our neighborhood needs clash. But our goal is that we have a street network that serves everyone. In planning jargon, that's called a complete street. Our city actually has a complete street ordinance that requires us, when we're building and enhancing and upgrading streets, to think about how they can accommodate something besides just the car. A lot of our city was built in the era of the car, and so a lot of our streets handle car traffic quite well. We're in the process of trying to add back in the pedestrian and the bicycle and the public transit pieces. And so that's where we get talking about multimodal connectivity in our network. And so when we talk about design guidelines, these are the types of things that we think about having to accommodate in what we call the right-of-way. The right-of-way is what the government owns for the street. Usually it's from the edge of sidewalk to edge of sidewalk. Sometimes there's a ditch in there to accommodate stormwater. But it's essentially the land that we have to play to fit all the stuff in. Now, all the stuff rarely fits, right? I often say that we have plenty of right-of-way where we don't need it and none of it where we do. And so we have to make decisions and priorities about how we fit all of the stuff in and where it goes. And so the thoroughfare plan helps do that through these design guidelines. Don't write the slide down. Now, the conventional way used to define streets is called the functional classification system. It's a federal government word. And that's really based on traffic volume, speed, something we call level of service, and so that's really how congested a street is, and things like that. It's primarily, if not exclusively, oriented to automobiles. And so how bicycles and pedestrians and things like that fit into the functional classification system is really absent from the federal system. And so that's why we started integrating design guidelines to figure out how that stuff fits in. Now, there are four general types of roads in the functional classification system. So at the top, you have interstates, expressways, freeways. And so think I-465, I-65, I-70, right? Limited access, they go super fast. Their job is to move people from one part of the city to the other or one part of the country to the other, right? Below that, you have arterials. Those are major roads. Think Keystone Avenue, Washington Street, Madison Avenue, 82nd Street, places like that. They move traffic across the city. They do it at relatively high speeds, but there's also some access to surrounding properties provided, right? You can turn into businesses from them. It's not just about moving traffic. Below that, we have what we call collector streets. And those are really the streets that get you from those major roads into neighborhoods. And so they collect traffic into the major system And at the bottom of the scale, we have what we call local streets. And so many of you probably live on a local street. They're very low traffic. And so what do those things look like? This is if you can imagine 82nd Street or Washington Street, you can imagine an arterial. So they accommodate most of our traffic at some of the highest speeds. And so again, their goal is to move traffic from one place of the city to the other. Generally, we like to have them spaced between 1 and 4 miles apart. Now, obviously, in the core of the city, in the core of downtown, most of our streets are arterials. And that's because of the density of stuff that happens in the core of our city. Once you get out into the outer townships, then the arterials start getting spread out farther and farther apart because there's less of a density of activity, right? Now, below that are collectors. Collectors can be 2-lane roads, but they can also be 4-lane roads. They have moderate traffic volumes, and they have speed limits somewhere around 30, 35 miles per hour. And so if you're familiar with kind of subdivisions, this is like the road that has the sign for Whispering Pines or whatever the subdivision name is to get you into your neighborhood, right? These are the key roads. Generally, they're spaced about a half mile to a mile apart, and they're really intended to connect neighborhoods. And then at the bottom of the scale are local streets, and these are generally 2-lane streets. Very low traffic, generally very low speeds. They don't have the yellow line down the middle or the dash line down the middle. Oftentimes, it's super safe to walk and bike in these streets because of the traffic volume. So even in places in our city where we don't have sidewalks and don't have bike lanes, oftentimes the local streets accommodate that use pretty safely. So how does that all fit together into this federal functional classification system that we have? This is a diagram, and so you see that expressway, that I-465. You see the interchange onto the arterial road onto Washington Street or Keystone Avenue, and that connects, onto the collector road that gets you into your neighborhood where you have, where you park your car and where you live. So that's the functional classification system. I know, super exciting, but that is super important. A lot of our federal funding is tied to those roads. And so we receive federal funding for the higher roads, not for the local roads. And so you talk about different levels of maintenance on our streets. We receive federal support for our major arterial roads. We don't receive that for our local roads. And so that comes from our local property tax type of sources. Now here's what that looks like on the map in different parts of our city. And so there on the left, you see our map this is kind of focused on the Martindale-Brightwood neighborhood, but the core of our city. And so there in red or in purple, you see the interstate coming through. You can see that dumping cars onto the red lines. Those are our arterial networks. The blue lines are what feed that traffic into neighborhoods, and then you see the gray lines down there. And those are the local streets where most of our residents live. Now you see, because it's the core of the city, there's lots of activity and density of things. Those red lines are spaced pretty close together, right? And that's different than on the right side, where we have a suburban location. This is up in Pike Township. So you see the arterial roads are much further spread apart. And that's because there's less activity, there's less demand for that traffic. It's also because the development patterns are different. And on the left side of the screen, we have traditional gridded street patterns. On the right side, you see a lot of curvilinear, curvy, cul-de-sac streets that all funnel to one street. And so we'll talk a little bit more about that.
Question.
Yes?
How can 10th Street be is that 10th Street, be a primary arterial?
Yep, and so we do have primary arterials that are only 2 lanes. Both in the city, or in the traditional core of the city, like 10th Street, but also out in our townships, many of our primary arterials are 2-lane kind of county roads. And so if you've been down into Franklin Township, there's Thompson Road and Edgewood Avenue and places like that. Those are 2-lane county roads. And so those are roads. In 10th Street case, there's not room to expand it, right? Because the businesses are right up against it, and it works. In places like the outer townships, we actually still do have plans to expand some of those streets. I'll talk about Indy Moves next time. We removed a lot of those expansion plans because the traffic volumes are not warranting them, and we also can't afford it. But there are places where we recognize that that's still a necessity. Now, in the zoning ordinance, which Daniel will talk about here in a little bit, we recognize that Indianapolis contains both those development patterns. We have both traditional city and we have suburban development. And so we, in our zoning code, talk about context areas. That's our word for those. And so we have the compact context area, which is the traditional gridded part of our city. Here's kind of the countywide map. So there in yellow is the traditional gridded part, the compact part. And so you think about those streets, and they're primarily streets that might have alley access. And so you drive into the back of your property. You don't necessarily have a lot of curb cuts on the front through the sidewalks. But we also have what we call the metro area. And so that's the area in blue or green on the screen. And so those are places where they're much more suburban development pattern. And so it is a lot of curb cuts connecting individual garages and properties directly to the street. Now, next time we'll talk a lot about the past, present, and future of transportation in our city. This functional classification system idea that we want to funnel all this traffic from low volume streets to high volume streets is not historically how much of our country was built, including the core of our city. When we built Indianapolis in the 1800s, there was no arterial designation or local street designation. There was a grid. Now, over time, that grid grew to some streets became busier and holding, carrying more traffic, and some became quieter. But the idea historically was that the grid was very flexible. If one street was down, you could just, cut across the corner and go up another one and make your way around. Now, over time, that has changed to today's system of functional classification, where basically, if that arterial road is down, what happens? You're stuck, right? There's really no alternative way. And so that system moves cars very efficiently. It keeps cars out of our neighborhoods, but it's not very resilient. When it's down, we have major congestion. It also means that we've got some very high traffic, high speed streets that are not very conducive to walking and biking. And so there's trade-offs between moving vehicles and kind of neighborhood livability. And so, like I said, next time we'll talk about the broader transportation plan called Indy Moves. We'll talk about Marion County Transit Plan. But we wanted you to kind of get a sense of how planners think about different types of streets and how they respond to different types of neighborhoods through something called our thoroughfare plan. All right, and so that is the basics of the thoroughfare plan. I know it's super exciting, but the idea that we think about streets, we topologize them, we think about different types of streets doing different types of things. We also do that when we think about land use planning, and so I'm going to bring Brittany back really to talk about, for those of you who were here the first time, to give you a brief refresher on what we call the pattern book, but also talk about how that responds to transportation. There was one question.
You can tell us what city it was.
What city it was? Anyone know what city this is?
No.
It's Denver. Yep. Watch out for that.
All right, thanks, Brad. Now that everybody's familiar with how planners understand the road classification and street networks, let's talk about how we can use this information to ensure our neighborhoods accommodate different types of users. So one way that we do this is through land use planning, which focuses on activities that take place in our communities, like residential, commercial, industrials, those uses that you discussed in the activity. The pattern book is a tool that we use in Indianapolis for land use planning. It's the element of the comprehensive plan that helps guide development and protects the character of neighborhoods. But it also makes sure that it provides some flexibility, enough to allow neighborhoods to grow and change over time. And the way that it accomplishes this is through providing a classification system based on neighborhood typologies. So these typologies, they provide recommendations for the land use with specific conditions. So there are 3 neighborhood typologies: living, working, and mixed use. And each of those have recommended uses outlined in the pattern book. So living is the first one. These are primarily residential, and here's a list of the uses that are included in living typology. The next one is working. So these are primarily residential areas. And here's a list of the different uses in those. And last one is a combination of living and working, which we call mixed use. They have a balance of residential and non-residential uses. And so when you're looking at the pattern book, you can think of the pattern book similar to a cookbook. Cookbooks have recipes which include specific ingredients. When mixed together with specific instructions, they can lead to a good result. So think of a cake. The ingredients may include milk, eggs, vanilla and sugar, flour, or baking soda. You have these ingredients, but it's essential to also have information like measurements, cook time, baking temperature, in order to end up with a delicious cake. Now think of a thriving community. You may have single-family homes, grocery stores, offices, apartments, schools, small shops, roads, and parks. Each of these elements are important, but we know neighborhoods aren't identical. Neighborhoods have different histories, land uses, and infrastructure needs. So this is how the pattern book handles those differences. They outline neighborhood types with specific recommendations for land uses and infrastructures needs in each community. So I'm gonna go back to the activity that we did earlier in the class. So for the second and fifth neighborhood, this is what this looks like. When you went over these neighborhoods, you made important observations about them. Different modes of transportation require different types of infrastructure. The pattern book specifies conditions for different types of neighborhoods, including building proximity to street, placement of garages, and building orientation. So in the case of neighborhood 2, according to the pattern book, this area would be characterized under the living typology because it's primary residential, and it would be classified as a traditional neighborhood. A couple of uses that are included in this particular typology are detached housing and large-scale multifamily. Okay. Some of the transportation-related conditions for detached housing include placement of garages. So in this case, it says garages should be loaded from an alley or a side street when possible. They should be detached if located on the side of the house. It also talks about the location of sidewalks and the location of parking. So in the case of large-scale multifamily, here are some of the transportation-related conditions. They address the street location and street type. These apartments should be located along an arterial street. It talks about the location of parking. Parking should be either behind or interior to the development, and special instruction for master plan communities. These are large developments that include multiple lots. So number 6, we talked about this. This one is industrial. So according to the pattern book, this area would be characterized under the working typology because it's primarily non-residential. A couple of the recommended land uses include heavy industrial and small-scale offices, retailing, and personal or professional services. Some of the transportation-related conditions for heavy industrial include specific instructions for trucks. The industrial trucks shouldn't utilize local or residential streets. It also includes the location of the road and road type. Streets internal to industrial development must feed onto an arterial street. And the last one is location of entrances. The primary entrance should be served by an arterial street. Okay, and this is the last one, the last transportation-related condition for small-scale offices, retailing, and personal or professional services. So the first one is proximity to the interstate. They should be adjacent to the interstate interchanges if present, If no interchange is present, it should be located along arterial streets at the edge of the industrial uses. The last one, building location. They should be located and served in such a way that the use will not interfere with the industrial traffic or loading. So these are just a few ways that we see land use and transportation kind of merge and form a neighborhood that's compatible for different modes of transportation.
Question.
Yes.
Is there a pattern book for Indianapolis with all of our neighborhoods that we can access?
So your question was, is the pattern book for Indianapolis available for you to access?
Yes.
Okay, the question is yes, and I'm really glad that you asked that question, because I'm going to mention your role in land use planning. So to answer your question, yes, it is available to you. And how you can use, your role in land use planning, you can advocate for development that fits your neighborhood. And you can also, if you're interested in leading a development project, you can use the pattern book as a reference guide. And then the last one, as the people who participated in People's Planning Academy in 2017 know, you can be a part of the update process. So like most planning documents, they must be updated. So you could play an important role in the update process. So the pattern book was recently updated, and it was adopted just a couple weeks ago. So our goal moving forward is to make sure you guys are equipped with the knowledge to be a part of those processes. All right, so I'm gonna go ahead and hand it over to Daniel to give us an overview of zoning.
All right, you guys. I feel very bad to take you away from your break to talk about zoning, as exciting as zoning can be, but I appreciate your patience and I'm excited to talk with you about it. So, what is zoning? Zoning is one of the primary tools that cities can use to regulate the built environment. And built environment is a term that you're going to hear urban planners use all the time. It sounds very fancy, but realistically, what that means is anything that we as humans build. So in the drawing, it's the buildings, it's the roads, it's the sidewalks. When you hear us talk about the built environment, you're hearing that's what we're talking about. And so the land use plan that we just talked about allows us to plan for the future, whereas zoning allows us to act on those plans. Going back to Brad's earlier metaphor, if the land use plan is something like climbing Everest, zoning is much closer to actually planning for Disney World. So I could literally spend a couple of hours here talking to you about zoning, the history of zoning, court cases, things like that. But here in Indianapolis, there are two primary parts to zoning. First, there's the zoning map, and then second, there's the development ordinance. The zoning map, this is oftentimes, when you think about a planning department in the city, this is what most people think about. The zoning map includes over 30 different zoning districts for residential, commercial, industrial, and mixed-use activities. The zoning map covers all of Marion County, and although when we say zoning map, oftentimes people think about a big map that you can pull out and you can look at, but the zoning map in Indianapolis is actually electronic. So it's maintained in electronic form. You can access it online. So all of Indianapolis divided into zoning districts. So how do we use those zoning districts? Well, let's go back to the development ordinance. Development ordinance is another one of these words that sounds very fancy, but in short, what this is, these are the rules for development in Indianapolis. The development ordinance is over 600 pages, and in 600 pages you can say a lot of things, but in short, what it says is what is allowed and what is not allowed. Traditionally, one of the earliest forms of like city planning, kind of in the current way that we think about it, was trying to separate incompatible uses. In this drawing, you see these two houses, you see a factory in the middle. Some of the earliest city planners, sort of like I am now, what their goal was to try and separate the factories from the housing. And in a lot of ways, our current zoning code does similar things. The development ordinance also includes rules about what buildings and some landscaping looks like. It also regulates special circumstances like floodplains. So there are parts of the city that we know are maybe dangerous to build, like floodplains, or there are areas where we need to be particularly sensitive to the environment. So we have special rules in those areas to make sure that development fits in with each place. So in this drawing, where do you feel like the rules maybe had an effect on what the built environment looked like? Everything. Yeah, let's break that down a little bit. Trees, yes, the trees. The development ordinance talks about both landscaping around parking lots, but also what are called street trees. These are trees that are right next to the sidewalk. In the summer, they provide shade so that you're walking, and they also are a way that when it rains, that they can help absorb water, so it helps limit flooding. So trees. What else in the drawing could be affected? Parking. Yes, there's some parking in the back. And the development ordinance does talk a lot about parking. It sets a minimum amount of parking, and it often generally sets a maximum amount of parking. So to make sure that, especially in Indianapolis, a lot of people drive cars, to dictate about what that parking looks like. What else? The type of building and the use, exactly. So going back to that example of what's allowed and what's not allowed. In this zoning district, this is a store, so this type of use would have to be allowed. And also, where the building is located and the height of the building could both be affected by the development ordinance.
I can't tell if that little box is the sign for the store.
Yep.
That would be part of it.
Yep, exactly. And in fact, we just did a major rewrite to the development ordinance that relates to signs, and there's a whole section that talks about what signs you can place and where you can place them. So literally everything, including the sidewalks are required by the development ordinance. So like anything from what is in the building to the size of the building to the parking associated with the building, both automobile and bicycle parking, trees and sidewalks are all, yeah, it is bike rack. It's not a great illustration, to be honest. But describing zoning ordinances is super fun. I was trying to be very fun and cute with the drawings. But literally everything in the drawing is affected by the development ordinance. And so, like, yeah, we get this. The entire drawing is affected by the development ordinance. But the way we write the rules can have a profound effect on what our city looks like and where we are today. Here are two examples. One on the left shows what development would look like somewhat under our zoning ordinance, and the development on the right looks like what a similar sort of store in a similar sort of location, but without any sort of development ordinance. And you can see in the illustration on the right, there are no sidewalks. There's a lot of parking, but there are no curb cuts, so the cars could pull in anywhere. The signs are located in two very different ways. And so there's also no landscaping, there's no trees. So if you're walking around, you don't get a lot of shade, and also that you don't get that extra help when it rains to be able to help drain stormwater. So the rules really do mean a lot, especially when you think about these rules apply to every single parcel across Indianapolis. Yeah.
As People's Academy and bringing the people element in, and also to Bridget's point earlier about advocacy, what are some tips for us to make sure our neighbors know where in ordinances to look? Say, for instance, a neighbor has an out-of-state landlord not keeping up the code of ordinances. Are there different tips that we can point them to just to
Yeah.
make sure they're keeping up the park properly?
Yeah, no, I think there definitely is. Let me come back to this. Let's put a pin in this question. Let me grab it right at the end. But the question is like, where can we go and look at the ordinance, and where can we maybe learn about the ordinance, so that as members of the community we can know what the rules are to make sure that everyone is kind of abiding by the rules. So let me get back to that one in just a second. We've talked about the rules. The rules can be great. They can create great places, but also keep in mind that there are some downsides to zoning. There are a lot of criticisms of zoning, including it has been used for discriminatory and exclusionary purposes. In the illustrations to the top, it shows ways in which that zoning could potentially be used for discriminatory purposes, particularly A lot of zoning ordinance will have very large minimum lot sizes, and they may also have minimum square footages for buildings. So if you were inclined to be exclusionary, what you could do is you can make really big lots, you can require really big houses, and so this would make it really expensive to move into neighborhoods. So this would be one way of trying to design a neighborhood so that it had exclusionary purposes. Only a certain people with a certain amount of money can move into that neighborhood. And the example to the bottom shows a similar amount of land, but with different types of housing, whether it's small houses, kind of medium-sized houses, duplexes, or even small apartment complexes with similar design standards, but they offer a wider variety of housing stock, so you can have a wider variety of people live within the neighborhood. Also, other downsides of zoning is oftentimes people talk about how it's too rigid and it prevents innovation because there are rules, they're passed by the council, and they can't just change whenever you want to, so they're kind of stuck. It also works well, it generally works pretty well for individual parcels, but it doesn't really work well when you try and tie places together. A lot of what we've talked about with our land use plan is kind of this recipe idea of we want to be able to create communities and neighborhoods. And neighborhoods will have houses, but they also may have small stores, and all of these things will work together, whereas each of the individual rules are generally applied on a parcel by parcel basis. So that's not always ideal when you're trying to create communities. So what if we want to change the rules? Yep. I'm sorry. Okay, very cool, awesome. So, what if we want to change the rules? Fortunately, we can update both the development ordinance and the zoning map. The development ordinance is changed often once or twice a year whenever we have a large project, like we had to update our sign ordinance to reflect recent court cases, but also periodically we need little tweaks within the zoning ordinance because this is what regulates all 350,000 parcels within Marion County. But you have to be very careful. When you update the whole zoning ordinance for a single zoning district, you can affect a lot of people very, very quickly. So we have to be very judicious, and we're often very slow. We have a lot of public input when we're thinking through the development ordinance changes. The zoning map is something that we update dozens of times each year. And let's talk a little bit more in depth about what does it look like to update the zoning map. So, if you want to change the zoning map, first, someone has to request a change. In Indianapolis, that's often a property owner, but the city, if it looks and sees an area that is improperly zoned or it's prohibiting future development, the city can also be that applicant. Next, the staff prepares a report on existing conditions and provides a recommendation. So they look at existing conditions, but they also look at the plans that we've created to be like, hey, does what the applicant wants make sense within the context of the surrounding neighborhood and with these surrounding plans? Once the staff report is written and the recommendations are made, the report and the recommendations are given to the Metropolitan Development Commission, who approves or denies a rezoning. These are people who specialize in zoning. They particularly specialize in land here in Marion County. And ultimately, after going through the Metropolitan Development Council, the City County Council has the ability to review a case, and it ultimately either enacts or decides to not enact the rezoning. So it's a multi-step process. There are public hearings before the Metropolitan Development Commission, particularly the hearing examiner hears the case. And once again, the city is constantly changing and evolving, and so the maps and the rules also need to evolve too. And that can be very good because things are going to be changing in the future. But when we change the rules, we change it for future projects. Buildings and structures that were built before the rules were created are, generally speaking, they're allowed to stay the way that they were built. There are a few exceptions to this. Whenever someone wants to come in and either you want to change a use, you want to change a building, if you're expanding the building, or if you're tearing down and rebuilding, then you're generally going to have to meet the new city code. But we do recognize that when we change the rules, people who've invested money and time in the existing buildings, that we're going to honor the rules that were in place when they built those things. Yeah?
What about when like full transparency, that's when we
Mhm.
You know, some of that code is still being required in the city.
Yeah.
So how do you accommodate that? You know, a house is built in 1940 would have a very different electrical wiring system, or even building, you know, not to aluminum or whatever. And what we have now, would you, I mean, how would we accommodate, not making it big changes, but, you know, also keeping it safe for the surrounding property?
Yeah, I mean, one thing to keep in mind is that a lot of electrical and wiring and plumbing, these are all dictated by building code, and building code is something separate than the zoning ordinance. So building code is like you want to go get a building permit, and you have to be able to meet standards to make sure your house is sufficiently safe. Those are also updated. I can't speak in entire detail to that just because it's somewhat outside of kind of planning, but potentially the possibility of being able to, through incentive programs or other ways, whenever the building is updated or renovated, to make sure that they're meeting code as part of those updates or renovations. So part of zoning and part of just updating a city is trying to update the rules, try to make sure everyone knows that the rules are updated, and then try and support people so that when they have to be able to update their building or their place to be able to reflect the current code, that they'll be able to do it. So this leads us to questions. And this also kind of leads us back to your question. So how do we help people in our community know what the rules are? And in fact, this is a super good question. And if any of you, because it's the development ordinance is 650 pages, it is kind of a headache sometimes to get through. And it's sometimes intimidating for new people to jump into. So this is something that the development ordinance, along with the pattern book and the thoroughfare plan, are all available online. But even when things are available online, sometimes they can be difficult to jump into and understand. So I do feel like I think you can do anything from just trying to dive into the code. You can also reach out to the planning office. We actually have planners on call that if you come into the office, you can ask them just almost any sort of question that you want, and if they can either answer on the spot or try and follow up later. And I would be really interested in trying to hear your suggestions about what are ways that we can do this in the future, because I do feel like that's one thing we want to be better at in the future, is to try and be able to convey these really complex ideas in increasingly accessible ways. But we're maybe not there yet.
And I'll also say the final class, so class 6, will actually start getting into more detail about how you actually participate in public hearings and like your role in all that process. And so that's when we're starting to prep you for, you know, after you've learned all this stuff, how you actually effectively use it to fight for your neighborhoods. So stay tuned for some of that too. All right, so we've got 5 or 6 minutes for questions. And so you got all 3 of us up here, so feel free to ask. Gary.
I just want to make 2 statements. In my experience and from what I see in Indianapolis, there are a lot of exceptions to many things. There's the code, it's pretty well set in stone, but there are many exceptions. And, you know, one thing that makes me wonder, you know, like if I built a CVS at Washington and Sherman 15 years ago, apparently I didn't have to make it terribly accessible to pedestrians, and then it just kind of stays that way forever. You know, right in front of a curb cut for the handicap, they roll across the intersection, and then there's parking barriers right in front of them, and they have to enter from the driveway and stuff. So that would be great if the city could fix that. Also, well, I just want to get that out here. And the other thing is that zoning and what can or cannot go into a neighborhood, that used to be the case. But nowadays, if I have an app on my phone and I have a business based on that app, or I'm using a business based on that app, and you know what I'm talking about, it just blows your zoning ordinance to smithereens. So that would also be a good thing to put into your course at some point.
So that's a good point. And so if you couldn't hear Gary, there's a comment about grandfathering and how we have kind of antiquated land uses on a lot of our commercial corridors, and you know, as Daniel mentioned, you know, those we don't retroactively force people to upgrade. They get upgraded when new development happens, and so People can reuse that building if they were to tear it down. If you look at some of the newer CVS's in your case that you mentioned, we actually require a pedestrian connection from the front door to the sidewalk. And so as new stuff gets built, that's how we influence the city. Yeah, so that's that piece. The other piece is home-based businesses. And so our zoning code does talk about home-based businesses. There's incredible disruption in it. So Airbnb, for example, you've got basically hotel rooms in your neighborhoods, and so that's great for some people.
It doesn't have to be their home.
I know, and so there's issues like that. The state has become involved in that, and long story short, the state has really limited our ability to regulate some of that. But that is a good point into, that's very disruptive. 5 years ago, we didn't have Airbnb in our neighborhood. And so that's, there's constantly, the pace of change in our world is really rapidly expanding, and so it's harder, to gain this point when you update the code 1 or 2 times a year.
Limiting with you too.
Yep. All right, next question, ma'am.
How often does the state require municipalities to update their comp?
So the question was, how often does the state require cities to update their comp plan? The answer is there's no requirements. The state enabling legislation, so the stuff that says to do comp planning, is actually extremely weak in Indiana. Our comprehensive plan can literally be 3 paragraphs. A map's not even required. So obviously most cities, including us, do lots of maps, and we include transportation and resiliency and all that stuff in it. But the state is actually fairly silent on what needs to be in it and how often it should be updated. Generally, we are attempting to get to kind of a 6 to 10 year update cycle for all of our pieces. That has historically not been the case, but that's where we're trying to go. Other questions?
How long have we had the complete streets ordinance, and why didn't we have it sooner?
So the question was about our complete streets ordinance and why we didn't have it sooner. I believe 2012 is when it passed council. Why we didn't have that sooner, I guess I can't exactly say. I will say that the idea of complete streets is something that we had in the 1800s, 1920s, kind of things like that, because that's what we used. We got away from that. And so now there's kind of a movement going across the world that the idea that maybe that wasn't so good that we lost the ability. Kind of the next phase of that is this thing called Vision Zero. Vision Zero is this idea that the goal of our transportation system is that no one dies on it. And so the idea that there are no accidents. Every collision that happens, whether it's between cars or between cars and people or cars and bikes, there's reasons that happens. And so we need to think about why those happen. Some of those are engineering reasons. We design bad intersections and bad facilities. Some of those are education things, and so people drink and drive, they text and drive, and things like that. But that's kind of the next phase. And so I think in cities, you see complete streets ordinances happen, and then 5, 6, 10 years later, we come back with Vision Zero. Vision Zero is actually a piece of our ADU's transportation plan that I'll talk about next time.
Yeah, that's true. And just to piggyback on the why things happen, especially in regards to infrastructure, we're going to take a deep dive in class 2 about transportation history and how transportation has evolved and impacted the built environment.
You talk about planning and you talk about your major thoroughfares and stuff, and yet you come out with Blue Line. You're going to take a major thoroughfare and cut it down to 2 lanes when it can't fit the accommodations it's got now. How do you justify something like that?
So the question is about the Blue Line, but there's also the red and purple, the idea that we take a major thoroughfare that has historically carried a lot of vehicles and basically dedicate lanes for buses instead of cars anymore. And so how do we justify that? I will say that at one time Washington Street had trolley tracks in it. They're still there. In the winter, you'll see the potholes, they pop up over the tracks. College Avenue was similar. And so while we're changing them from 4-lane cars to 2-lane cars, same with Meridian Street, that's not necessarily always been that way. And kind of get to the complete streets idea. We have to be able to move cars, but we also have a growing piece of our community that values public transportation. Their voices matter too. There's a growing part of our community that values walkability and walking to places and biking to places. And so the idea of complete streets is that we've got all of these competing values in our community. No one's right, no one's wrong. They're just different. And we have to figure out ways that we can accommodate those competing values. And so there are streets that we want to dedicate to cars. So Keystone Avenue on the north side, for example, is one of those streets. But there are also streets that are more appropriate for bikers and pedestrians and public transit.
And we voted.
And there was the referendum. We'll talk about the Marion County Transit Plan, so Indigo will be here next time to talk about that class. So you might have some questions for them. All right, a couple more questions and we'll get on your time and let you go.
We can talk about induced demand.
When we talk about induced demand, we can. And so the idea that if you build roads, if you build parking spaces, they will fill up. And so we can talk a little bit about that. And if you've ever, this is especially true on the interstate highway system, but we keep widening I-69, for example, and it keeps getting congested. That's because we make it easier and easier to use that mode of transportation. And so the idea of widening streets actually does not solve congestion, it creates it. So we can, that's a good point. We can try to weave that into the conversation and talk about that concept. All right, any final questions? Is there an Office of Innovation? I think Daniel has the only title in the city-county enterprise that I know of that involves the word innovation. We don't have a specific team. I think there's a group of very smart people throughout city government that often talk to one another from the mayor's office on down. We do not have a dedicated team like some cities have a smart cities team, or Boston has this thing called the Office of New Urban Mechanics, which is their kind of innovation hub. But we do not have that formal office here. All right, so on your tables, you should have surveys. We really appreciate you completing those out so that we can do a better job with them next time. Yeah, just leave them on the table. And I promise this is the 101 class, and so it's not the most exciting, but it's all the fundamentals that you will need when we start talking about the fun stuff. So the history of transportation, transit-oriented development, all that sort of stuff. And so bear with us, and we look forward to seeing you next time. Thanks.